I have tutored the GRE and the GMAT for about 6 years now, and you'd expect me to have a clear preference. You should always do the GRE or the GMAT is way better, but no, it's a much more complicated story than that. And I think that there are videos out there explaining why GRE, why GMAT, but they're a few years old now, and I think we deserve a 2020 edition of the ultimate question, GRE versus GMAT. And I am here to give you that 2020 answer to the question. As you might have guessed from the title of the video, it comes down to 8 deciding factors, and each of them are important. For you, maybe only 1 or 2 of them are the most important, but for other people, a different set will be more important. So I recommend you watch all of them and then make up your mind at the end. These are not in any particular order. I think the last deciding factor is just as important for some people as the first one. But as this will be a fairly long video, let me get to the first deciding factor. Number 1 is your school. There is no substitute for going online or phoning up your school to check whether they prefer the GRE or the GMAT, or indeed if they only accept one of those 2 exams. There's no point listening to all of this advice if the school and the program you're looking for only accept the GMAT or the program only accepts the GRE. In that case, the decision is made, you have to pick that exam. Now, if you're going to business school or doing an MBA, the chances are overwhelmingly likely that your school will accept the GMAT. Many of those schools will also accept the GRE. It used to be super simple. If you were going to business school, you had to do the GMAT. Now it's a bit more complicated. If you're going to business school, you definitely can do the GMAT, they will accept it, but many schools, and you'd have to check your one, will also accept the GRE. And I know you're thinking, well, which one should I do then? But that's the rest of the video. I'm going to be explaining the other deciding factors to help you choose. Now, the GRE is applicable not only for most or many business schools, but for a host of other graduate programs, which again boils down to deciding factor number 1, go online and check the program that you wish to apply for and see whether they accept both the GRE and the GMAT or only one of those 2 exams. While you'll have to check for your school, in terms of statistics, around 8,000 business schools, universities and other institutions accept the GMAT, while around 2,000 accept the GRE. On the other hand, 300,000 students a year do the GMAT, while 600,000 students approximately a year do the GRE. So the GRE is more popular in that sense. Now, many of you are thinking, but what about the top universities like Stanford, Harvard, LBS, INSEAD? Well, I've curated what they say about GMAT versus GRE in the following images. In terms of Stanford Business School, you can see here that either the GMAT or the GRE is required for admission, and that we have no preference for one test over the other. Furthermore, if you take both exams, you may provide both scores. For Harvard Business School, it says that their program accepts either the GMAT or the GRE as part of the application process. We do not have a preference for either test. For London Business School, the story is a bit different. They emphasize the GMAT, but then at the end talk about we accept the GRE. However, you should be aware that some employers may ask for a GMAT score. Now, one of my later deciding factors in that choice GMAT versus GRE will talk about employment, but for now you can see that the school itself accepts both GMAT and GRE. And finally, for INSEAD, you can see that they accept both the GMAT and the GRE, although their scoring requirements are slightly different for each exam. It's time for deciding factor number 2. The fact that the schools tend to publish more about their GMAT score range than their GRE score range. And how does that affect you? This basically means that many schools like to show off about the GMAT scores of their students. So if you're aiming for or expecting above a 700, this plays into your hands. You can get a great GMAT score and then the schools will want you so that they can show off in their stats and boost their average GMAT score. With a great GRE score, maybe they're not as bothered as they don't publish those stats as often, and there's not as many ranking tables about the GRE scores of a typical business school. What does it say that in 2020 schools don't publish the average GRE score of their intake? Maybe it says they don't care as much about a slightly lower score. So again, if you're not as confident in either test and your school accepts both and you're expecting a lower score, maybe a school will turn a blind eye to a lower score because they're not going to publish those stats. Again, this is speculation, but there must be a reason why they publish their GMAT score range much more often than their GRE score range. And this brings me nicely to deciding factor number 3, scholarships. If, again, you're one of those people who are expecting a stellar score that's above a 700 in the GMAT or above a 325, 326 in the GRE, well then the limited evidence available suggests that you're more likely to get a scholarship with a stellar GMAT score. I've done hours of research for scholarships around the world, and I've just brought you here a couple of pages to show you what I mean. This is a page on the official GMAC website listing European business schools offering GMAT exam-based scholarships. You can see that there are quite a few schools, including very popular ones like CAS and ESEC, HEC and HALT, that offer scholarships based on GMAT scores. But they're not the only ones. I've found several US business schools that offer scholarships based on a stellar GMAT score. On their websites, they don't mention giving scholarships for top GRE scores. That's not to say that they wouldn't, just that they don't mention that fact. As this former admissions director at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business and now an MBA prep coach for MLT says, someone with a 770 GMAT is much more likely to get a financial award than someone with a 670. It can be much more likely for that business school to want to buy that high GMAT score. Speaking of scores, at this point I'd like to plug my channel, which of course is dedicated to helping improve both your GRE and GMAT score. Please leave a like and a comment if this is helping at all so far. Time for deciding factor number 4, the verbal section of the tests. Now, the next deciding factor or 2 will be about the material covered in the tests themselves. So there's an obvious point to make before I go into too much detail. You can do a free online test of each exam from the official sites respectively, and that will give you a great indication of everything that I'm talking about. If you're still in doubt, that can be your final deciding factor. Go do a free test of each and see which one you enjoyed the most. If you enjoy it, you're more likely to revise it and do better at it. But now let's get talking about the verbal. Let's start with what they have in common, reading comprehension. For either test, you're going to have to get used to reading passages of 3 to 4 paragraphs in length and answering questions about them. There's no way around it. I've done several videos about the best techniques to answer reading comprehension questions, but both tests have that in common, so the advice applies to both. Now would be a good point to mention that I got a 780 in the GMAT and a 340 in the GRE, and I have tutored over 1,000 students in either exam, so I know a thing or two about what I'm talking about. For the GMAT, the remaining 2 sections of the verbal reasoning part of the test are critical reasoning and sentence correction. Now, the critical reasoning I feel is slightly harder on the GMAT. The GRE has a tiny bit of critical reasoning, but the other 2 main sections are sentence equivalence and text completion, and both of those rely heavily on vocabulary. For the GMAT, it's not at all about vocabulary, or minimally. It's much more about your usage of grammar and learning about 20 to 30 grammar rules And then sentence correction will test those grammar rules again and again and again. Always the same 30 or so grammar rules. For the GRE, it's much more about memorizing hundreds or preferably thousands of fancy words. So which one sounds more appealing to you? If you're someone with a dictionary-like vocabulary who loves learning new words, then you might be more suited to the GRE. But if you're someone who loves grammar or loves breaking down complex arguments, then you're more suited to the critical reasoning of the GMAT. Deciding factor number 5, quantitative reasoning or maths. Now, with my thousands of hours of tutoring these two, I can safely say that the GMAT maths is just that bit harder, especially for newcomers. Why so? Well, there's a section in the GMAT maths called data sufficiency, and it takes students months sometimes to really understand what's being asked in data sufficiency. Other people grasp it immediately, but for some people it takes ages just to even assess, what are you asking me? What answer do you want? Whereas for the GRE, the categories are simpler. Most of the questions are problem solving, and the remaining are data interpretation, which is just reading graphs, or quantitative comparison, which is literally, is this bigger or that bigger? It's an easier question to understand, and many students understandably find that a bit easier. With GMAT data sufficiency, they're basically always trying to trick you. Whereas with the GRE, you don't get that sense as much. The questions aren't designed to trick you, they're just designed to test your knowledge. Whereas in the GMAT, I can honestly say a lot of the data sufficiency questions seem to be designed to give you a trap answer. With the GMAT, there's no calculator, whereas with the GRE, there's a calculator. So for many other students, that could be a deciding factor. Also, the GRE is a bit less adaptive. There are just those categories basically of easy, medium and hard. Whereas for the GMAT, it's much more adaptive. Every single question, especially after the first 8 or 10, is adapted to your level. So if you do well, the questions will get harder and harder and harder. And if you do badly, the questions will get easier and easier on a per question basis. Finally, and many people don't know this, the curriculums for the two quant sections are almost identical. There's about a 95% overlap. So if you study for the quant of one exam for a month and then need to switch, everything you've learned is likely to be useful for the other exam. There is a huge overlap. Where isn't there an overlap? Well, it's in these niche areas. Like for the GRE, they test normal distribution and box plots, whereas in the GMAT, they don't. And also in the GRE, there are graph, pie chart and table-based questions, whereas in the GMAT, they're reserved for a separate section, which we'll talk about in a minute, integrated reasoning. They're not part of the quant in that same sense. With everything I just said there on quant, many of you are thinking, oh, well, the GRE is the obvious choice, right? It's just easier. Well, it depends. If you want to show off your quant ability, or even want to make up for a quant deficit you feel in your academic background, then you might decide to do the GMAT because there's more room for stretch. There's more room to have a show-off score. I feel like it's much harder to get a 51 in GMAT quant, that's a perfect score, than a 170 in GRE quant. Many more students get that. Having said that, it's also true to say that a score much above 750, 760 in the GMAT really won't make that much difference. It might marginally help you get a scholarship, but won't massively affect the application in terms of getting a 780 versus getting a 760. The difference between a 750 and a 700 is more significant. And of course, the difference between a 700 and a 650 is also quite significant. Just to reassure you at this point, some of my students though have gotten to top schools like LBS and Stanford with scores in the low 600s, so it is possible. Deciding factor number 6. Arguably this might be the least important, but if you like essays, you might be more drawn to the GRE. There you have to do 2 essays of half an hour each. For the GMAT, it's just 1 essay. But the GMAT makes up for it by having this section called the integrated reasoning section, which is again half an hour. Now there's so much speculation about whether the universities really care about the essays or the integrated reasoning. No one knows, but a lot of them say that they do want good scores, so they're definitely worth trying and not skipping over. So in that sense, if you like essays, there's less to prepare for the GMAT, where there's just 1 essay, more to prepare for the GRE, where there are 2 different essays, analyse an issue and analyse an argument. Weirdly enough, and this is not true of the GMAT, there is also an experimental section of the GRE. So that's at least half an hour of your life taken up by a section of the GRE that won't actually count towards your final score. Thing is, you don't know which section it is. Might be the first, might be the middle, might be the last. So you have to treat every single one as if it's a real question. I think back a couple of years ago, they took those questions out of the GMAT, so all the questions count now for the GMAT. That's not true for the GRE, for what it's worth. Deciding factor number 7, practical differences. For many people, they won't worry too much about this. For other people, it will mean a lot. The GMAT costs more. As of making this video, it costs about $50 more than the GRE. So the GRE is cheaper. But for the GMAT, you can take it again after 16 calendar days, whereas for the GRE, you have to wait 21 calendar days. So there's less time if you need a retake. With the GMAT, you can get back in there after only about 2 weeks. For the GRE, it takes about 3 weeks. Also, in terms of taking the test, with the GRE, you can skip forwards and backwards between questions. I don't really recommend doing this, but you do have that option. If you see a really hard passage, you can just skip it, try other questions, and then come back to it if you have time at the end. I always recommend at least clicking the button so you have an answer in place. In fact, ideally with the techniques that I have in my videos, you wouldn't need to guess at all, you would just answer each one in turn, but it is an option you have for the GRE, which you don't have for the GMAT. You can't come back to questions on the GMAT. You answer a question, you move on. You can't go back. Here's one thing they have in common. You can take both tests 5 times in 1 year. That's a rolling year, not a calendar year. So if you take your first test in September, you can take 4 more before September of the following year. Don't be embarrassed about retakes. Many people do it, and I'll be having a video on that topic coming up soon. Deciding factor number 8, employment opportunities. This is something I didn't know as much about before researching extensively for this video, but some employers, particularly high-end consulting firms, do require a GMAT score, and that might lead you more towards taking the GMAT. Take this Corporate Recruiters Survey 2018 conducted by the official Graduate Management Admissions Council. They asked the question, does your company use candidates' GMAT scores as part of the hiring decision? The response was as follows. 6% said they use the GMAT score, 21% said they sometimes use GMAT scores, and 72% said they do not use the GMAT score. As they say at the bottom, this shows that the GMAT score plays a role in varying degrees in the hiring process of a sizable number of companies. Or take this 2019 Poets and Quants article written by a Stratus admissions consultant. They say down here, some of the more prestigious management consulting firms require the GMAT and take into account your score when offering interviews to MBA graduates. If you're sure you want to work at McKinsey or Bain, for example, you would be well served to take the GMAT. Students admitted with a GRE score who decide later to pursue consulting often have to take the GMAT during the second year of their MBA program. Not a very appealing option. Notice also in the paragraph above, it said, among admissions committees surveyed, 26 prefer the GMAT, 2% prefer the GRE, and all the rest do not have a preference. Only a small section of you watching this video though are going to go on to specifically a consulting role, so don't let that give you the impression that all employers prefer the GMAT to the GRE. That's not the case at all. Many of them won't even ask for your score, and many of them will also not have a strict preference between GRE and GMAT. Let me now end this video by giving you my personal take. I feel that the GMAT is better at stretching those higher score students and leading you to a more impressive overall score. However, I feel the GRE, especially in terms of quant, is that bit easier. And so if you want to sneak under the radar and you feel you have an otherwise impressive application, then maybe think about the GRE. But if you want to show off your quant ability, think much more about the GMAT. One thing to bear in mind, I've seen many of my students switch between the two exams and they don't experience a massive score boost. The exams aren't as different as many people lead you to believe. If you're not doing well in one, chances are you're not going to do as well in the other. You need to have a fundamental reassessment of your approach. As I said at the beginning, if in doubt, do one test in each, and there are score converters out there to convert your GRE score to a GMAT score so you can compare your performance in either. If I had to end on one piece of advice, it would be this. Phone up, or better yet, physically go to the schools that you are considering. Why is this such a good idea? You can ask people directly whether they prefer the GRE and the GMAT, and they might give you a more honest, straightforward answer for their schools. Number two, you'll meet alumni and current students, and that looks great on an application. You can talk about the people you've met from the school that you're applying to. So if, after watching these 8 deciding factors, you still can't make up your mind, pop along to the schools you want to go to, and they can give you their advice on which exam to take. And better yet, the experience of being there and then talking about that experience and those conversations in your application could make the difference that gets you into those schools anyway. It's a win-win. I hope that this video has helped you in your decision between the GRE and the GMAT, or at the very least it's given you plenty of information about both exams. As I said, I scored a 780 in the GMAT and a 340 in the GRE, and I have dozens of videos to help you with either exam, whichever one you choose. If this has helped in any way, as a thank you for the dozens of hours of research I've put into it, please do leave a like, leave a comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching.